Very well. I think we're all here and we can begin our event. My name is Stefano Gennarini from the Center for Family and Human Rights, also known as CFAM. I welcome you all here today for this special event on the social and legal challenges that fuel the trafficking in women and children. It will be a wonderful event. We have survivor leaders amongst us to answer some fundamental questions that are facing the international community, but families and countries all around the world. How can children be protected from online predators? How do predators evade law enforcement? What laws are needed to make sure traffickers don't use the internet to lure vulnerable women and children and profit from their trafficking? What indicators can help health providers detect victims of sex trafficking? These are just some of the urgent questions that families and policymakers are facing across the globe. We have remarkable panelists with us today, but before we turn to our panelists, we would like to hear from the member states who are hosting this event. And so I would like to give the floor to first His Excellency Mr. Yuri Ambrazevich, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Republic of Belarus.
Thank you, dear moderator, dear participants, colleagues, distinguished guests, excellencies. I'm privileged to welcome all of you at our side event on a very topical issues pertaining to trafficking in persons. And I would like to thank our long-time and reliable partner, CFAM, for their valuable contribution and assistance in organizing today's meeting. We are also grateful to the Philippines as the co-sponsor of the event and one of the active members of the group of Friends United Against Human Trafficking, as well as to UNODC, Exodus Cry, and Campaign Life Coalition, to our distinguished panelists and guests for participating in this event. Despite the fact that the problem of human trafficking continues to be the focus of global efforts for quite a long time already, the urgency and relevance of this matter has not disappeared. Instead, in many ways, it's been augmented with new dimensions and shades. To put it straight, the transnational scourge of human trafficking, including women and children, is still a pervasive crime which continues to flourish. The International Labour Organization has published its newest report indicating that the number of victims of trafficking or forced marriage globally went up from 40 to 50 million people in just 5 years, which means that 1 out of 150 people in the world today is basically a slave. Back in 2005, President of the Republic of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, speaking at the United Nations, put forth an important initiative to consolidate global efforts in fight against human trafficking. Exactly at that time, more than 15 years ago, he foresightedly noted that the importance of this topic would not subside. He said that it would only intensify in the future, for which we must all be prepared. Today we all see that those conclusions have turned out to be the absolute truth. It's due to the evolution of modern challenges and problems that the situation with human trafficking has significantly aggravated nowadays. And the existing traditional destabilizing factors have been exacerbated by new triggers such as global food insecurity and real threat of hunger, as well as the consequences of the pandemic with all related COVID effects, including the impact of lockdowns and lack of social communication. All this has transformed the problem of human trafficking into a more sophisticated criminal activity. That is why we must accept and understand the conditions in which we operate these days. Unfortunately, the available statistical data on the scope of criminal activity and its victims appears to be only the tip of the iceberg. We need to substantially improve not only the reporting mechanisms, but also the methodology for statistical data collection and analysis. Trafficking in persons, especially women and girls, for the purpose of sexual exploitation remains the most lucrative dimension of this negative phenomenon. In this regard, it is time to confront the demand for sexual exploitation and stop paying for trafficking. The need to comprehend the new reality in fight against human trafficking is vital for us in order to define how best to use the tools that we have at our disposal. And such tools, fortunately, are quite wide and comprehensive at the level of the United Nations. First, I want to know that back in 2010, Belarus stood at the origins of the adoption of the United Nations Global Plan of Action against Trafficking in Persons, which provides a solid framework for the international community to address the crime. The Global Plan of Action builds on the Palermo Protocol, which is the backbone of all international efforts to combat trafficking in persons. The other tools are worth mentioning too. The UN Voluntary Trust Fund for Victims of Trafficking in Persons, the Group of Friends United Against Trafficking, the establishment of the World Day Against Trafficking in Persons, just to remind you, July 30, regular high-level events to review the progress in the implementation of the Global Plan of Action, and the political declarations that are traditionally adopted at such events keep the issue of trafficking in persons, particularly women and children, high in the UN agenda and steer the international community in the right direction of multiplying efforts to combat this crime. Still, there are certain prerequisites and causes that continue to fuel trafficking in persons. Our late Minister of Foreign Affairs of Belarus, Vladimir Makey, wrote about economic and social challenges in terms of their impact on the increase in case of human trafficking in his article for the Journal of International Relations in January 2013. And for reference, just some quoting from this article very shortly. Human trafficking is underpinned by economic and social causes. In economic terms, it is a byproduct of globalization that is driven by its own supply and demand logic. The latter involves the demand for sexual and labor services, which is the largest in affluent countries. The supply, in turn, stems from poor countries, where some people are keen to attain better life in more prosperous states. Yet, setting out in search of happiness abroad, future victims of trafficking do not foresee that they may fall victim to exploitation in order to satisfy the above demand. Stop quoting. We have to recognize that many problems in the realm of combating trafficking in persons still remain to be properly addressed. Pervasive impunity, lack of adequate responses to trafficking, unavailable reporting mechanisms, inadequate international cooperation, and sufficient resources for supporting victims of the crime, and negative social norms are among the few factors that impede our fight. On the top of that, we face new trends. Technology has become the single greatest facilitator of human trafficking, serving as a crucial tool for traffickers to recruit, advertise, control, and exploit their victims. This facilitator has relocated trafficking in persons into digital space. The victims of trafficking appear to be the most vulnerable among those affected by the cyber crisis. All these challenges require transparent transnational cooperation. And to this end, we have to scale up our concerted efforts in strengthening partnerships through proper international cooperation, including here at the UN. Belarus will also continue taking consistent steps in the global fight against trafficking in persons, including through facilitating the biennial resolution, improving the coordination of efforts against trafficking in persons, as well as coordinating the work of the Group of Friends United Against Human Trafficking and holding side events like the one we have today. Belarus is also happy to support the relevant initiatives of fellow member states, including the resolution trafficking in women and girls facilitated by Philippines. And let me conclude by reiterating that only through joint efforts of all stakeholders our work could succeed. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Yuri Ambrazevich, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Belarus. And I now invite His Excellency Mr. Antonio Lagdameo, Permanent Representative of the Republic of the Philippines to the United Nations. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Deputy Minister Yuri Ambrazevich, Excellencies, distinguished guests, Good afternoon. I thank the mission of Belarus for organizing this important event, which the Philippines is pleased to co-sponsor. Combating trafficking in persons, especially of women and children, is a top priority of my government. We utilize a whole of society approach in this all-out fight to save and protect our women and children. The Philippines ratified the Palermo Protocol and makes it part of the laws of the land. Congress passed our Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act in 2003. This legislation contains the 4 Ps of our anti-trafficking action, namely prevention, prosecution, protection, and partnerships. This law established the Interagency Council Against Trafficking, or IACAT, which is co-chaired by the Departments of Justice and of Social Welfare and Development. All agencies with mandates relevant to the protection of women, children, migrants, and refugees are involved in IACAT. Local governments are actively participating in IACAT's programs, and civil society organizations representing women, children, and migrants are also part of IACAT. As a result of these synergistic efforts of government, civil society, and the private sector, the Philippines has consistently ranked Tier 1 since 2016 in the Trafficking in Persons report. To ensure that no gaps in law could derail our efforts to go after human traffickers, the Anti-Trafficking Act was amended and expanded in 2012 and again in 2022 to cover all accomplices and accessories of human traffickers in its coverage. The amendments criminalized even the attempts to commit human trafficking. They also strengthened the mechanisms to combat trafficking in online and digital platforms. As a champion of anti-trafficking issues at the UN Forum, the Philippines facilitated the 2021 Political Declaration on the appraisal of the Global Plan of Action to Combat Trafficking in Persons. This declaration, which was adopted by consensus, condemns in the strongest possible terms all acts of trafficking in persons, including online sexual exploitation of women and children. This fall, the Philippines facilitated the biennial resolution, Trafficking in Women and Girls, in the Third Committee. We have facilitated this resolution since 1995, an indication of our advocacy and commitment to combat trafficking in women and girls. This resolution urges governments to support and allocate resources to strengthen preventive action, targeting situations and conditions that may fuel the demand that leads to trafficking in women and girls. This includes promoting education and empowerment of women and girls, raising awareness of trafficking issues, and promoting and protecting the human rights of all. 88 member states co-sponsored this resolution, an indication of our shared commitment to eliminating the evil that is human trafficking in our society. We are happy to partner with NGOs and civil society in this side event, as well as in other projects and programs to combat trafficking in women and children. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion this afternoon.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And we are privileged to have with us Delphine Chance, the director of the New York office of the UN Office for Drugs and Crime. Delphine, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Excellency Deputy Minister Ambrazevich, Ambassador Lagdameo, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to join you today on behalf of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime for this event, addressing the challenges linked to trafficking in persons. And of course, at the outset, I would like to thank the Parent Mission of Belarus and the Philippines for their kind invitation. The combat against trafficking is a major topic for UNODC, one of which we've concentrated our efforts for many years as the guardian of the Palermo Convent Protocol, which has now 180 member state parties, and the Palermo Protocol, which is the only legally binding international instrument on trafficking in persons. I would like to congratulate the Philippines for their skillful leadership in driving the negotiation of the resolution on trafficking in women and girls. And UNODC, as the coordinator of the Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking Persons, ICAT, has this long-standing relationship with the Group of Friends Against Trafficking in Persons, which is headed by Belarus. We've also been working very closely with some of the survivors' organizations present today, and we're very happy to have them join in a dedicated side event during the last appraisal of Global Plan of Action, which was in New York last year. Mr. Moderator, traffickers have kept pace with the digital transformation and are using technology at every stage of trafficking, from recruitment, exploitation, and control of victims to the laundering of the process of the criminal activity. It is therefore essential that domestic laws effectively address these developing practices by ensuring that what constitutes a crime offline is also a crime online. This question is paramount in the context of the misuse of traffickers of information and communication technologies to exploit people, including children. UNODC research has shown that the misuse of internet for trafficking purposes, and social media in particular, has been exacerbated since the COVID-19 pandemic. UNODC Global Case Law Database, called Sherlock, records a court case dating already in 2024 where traffickers had used the internet for their crimes. Since then, there's been an exponential growth of online-based human trafficking. States are fully aware of this and reaffirmed in the recent General Assembly resolution on trafficking in women and girls, will be adopted, passed very soon. They're concerned about the misuse of the ICT for different forms of exploitations. Some important steps should be taken or strengthened to better and more efficiently fight this crime, and these include some law enforcement officials who should continue to develop their capacities to uncover these illicit markets and collect digital forensic evidence in an effective, legal, and human rights compliance manner. The cooperation across coordination should be increased in the identification and the sharing of information on the misuse of new technologies for human trafficking, and this is pretty essential when we know so many countries could actually be involved through online activity. In view of the important role played by the technology companies in the detection of trafficking activities, there is a clear need for greater involvement and responsibility of the private sector, including social media platforms, internet service providers, and tech companies, to ensure that the online world does not offer safe havens for criminals. This involves stronger public-private partnerships with tech companies that should be developed to better monitor the content they host and report trafficking activities to law enforcement officials, as well as to remove the content to avoid further harm. These partnerships could also help investigators collect evidence linked to human trafficking. At the same time, governments need to increase their oversight of such companies through legal and regulatory frameworks that enable accountability when they are found to host trafficking activities and they do not address any illegal content. In addition to the adequate criminalization of technology-facilitated trafficking, protection measures that put the victims and the survivor at the center are essential to put an end to all trafficking in persons. As a starting point, it is vital to ensure that the victims of trafficking are not penalized or adversely affected by laws, policies, or other actions for acts they commit as a consequence of their situation. We need to remind ourselves that trafficking victims did not consent to be trafficked. They had no choice. They should therefore certainly not be punished and otherwise further harmed. Moreover, in addition to the gender-responsive and child-sensitive protection measures, access to justice for witnesses and survivors should be strengthened, with the provision of social support where appropriate, as well as a redress and remedies for people who have become victims of this crime. This is key to create a favorable environment for self-identification, but more importantly for reporting of such trafficking cases. Systems should be also responsive to the individual needs of survivors or of the person at risk of being trafficked, and be flexible enough to effectively respond to the needs and the vulnerabilities. UNODC always advocates for evidence-based responses. And in this respect, I'm pleased to let you know that our biennial global report on trafficking in person, that most of you know as GLOTIP, will be published next month and will address the opportunities presented by technology in states' responses to this crime. So both as an opportunity, but also as a vulnerability. As states are currently developing a new convention to address cybercrime, it is indeed important to underline the positive use of technology by law enforcement and see the potential that they're offering in the fight against human trafficking. This is also an element highlighted in the recent resolution on this topic, with states acknowledging the positive role of ICT can play. International, national, and civil society organizations such as WebIQ or NEMEC and many others have leveraged new technologies and, for example, developed software and algorithms that enable, for instance, just days ago, the detection of 120 cases of child sexual abuse online and potential child trafficking in Switzerland. New technologies used in line with appropriate safeguards can therefore offer solutions to this issue. ICAT had also highlighted this point in a statement released some months ago. So I'm pleased to note in this regard that we have new co-chairs of the ICAT as of 2023, the IOM and the Office of the SRSG on Violence Against Children, with whom UNODC have been working very closely and look forward to continuing this very close partnership. So in conclusion, Mr. Moderator, UNODC stands ready to assist states in their efforts and to address and end the misuse and abuse of information and communication technologies by human traffickers, and above all, to ensure that member states are providing adequate support and assistance to their survivors. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Delphine, and we can now pass to some of our panelists. Our first speaker on the panel will be Brooke Bello. She is an author, a thought leader, a justice advocate, an actress, a techie who holds a patent in mental health technology, which maybe she'll be able to speak to us later about. She's a survivor champion against human trafficking and the founding CEO of More to Life. She has founded many initiatives to help victims of trafficking and has spoken widely in civil society, academia, and in government agencies. And she has received awards from the White House, U.S. governors, Google, state and federal agencies. Her new book, Shame Undone, is out in 2023 and may also be soon made into a movie. Brooke, you have the floor.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, sir, from Belarus for hosting this extraordinary work, and I'm so excited that you are continuing this initiative. And dear sir, from the Philippines as well. I was up in the mountains near Davao City with friends talking to the militia about trafficking some years ago. And thank you to everyone here, Exodus Cry, CFEM. Thank you so much for having us. When I think of, as a survivor of human trafficking, when I think of human trafficking, having rescued over 10,000 victims with my staff and others, and having survived it, the fact that I can tie my shoes together and be here today is always a wonder to me. The fact that I can have 2 healthy dogs and be happily married. A lot of times we don't really realize the issues of victims of human trafficking around mental health, around physical health, around womb health, and the dynamics within society. And for victims of color, it's, for women and girls, period, it's extraordinarily, but for women of color, even more so. And so my work with friends in Ukraine recently at a summit in Lisbon, when I think of human trafficking now, I think of genocide, which means killing a tribe. But in 1948, the United Nations, with the Holocaust on everybody's mind, it became broader because of what the United Nations did. And what they did was extend that to a tribe, a race, a nation, and a group, even when there is bodily harm to someone and a mental health crisis. And so we all have to really begin to see human trafficking as a type of genocide of a particular group of individuals that are marginalized and that are extremely vulnerable. And so one of the key areas that needs to be focused on is prevention. When we knew that the war in Ukraine was about to happen, countries should have come together and already been pushing out to prevention, because where there are a disproportionate number of people that are able to serve those in need and war is going to break out, you know that women and children we know are extremely vulnerable. And so prevention funds and services already have to be in play. When we think about the gaps in services and the issues around human trafficking, we have to also think of boys, who are 33% of victims of human trafficking, of sex trafficking in the United States, and growing. And when I think of my own mental health, obviously, personally, I was made to have a ton of abortions, and I can't have children. So this issue around gynecological care for girls that are much younger than 20, 21, 25. The issue started 13, 12. The kind of gynecological exams that young girls need that have been violated start earlier. If it would happen for me, my gynecologist said I would have been able to have children. And unfortunately, my beautiful Italian husband and I cannot. When I think of the gaps in services, through the pandemic, we really saw a heightened level of human trafficking, which is really unfortunate, and a disproportionate of individuals around different countries and nations actually working together. And so many NGOs around the U.S. particularly were scrambling to provide innovative services to victims who were being trafficked even more, and sometimes in fear of coming to service. And then obviously in Florida and different states, perhaps in Belarus, rents have gone up. It's very difficult to provide housing. So all of these things are essential. But when I think about the issue around mental health, one of the things that we're doing, which people can really look at, is that I'm partnering with the guys that created Call of Duty, my co-founders, and Avalon, is our mental health tech is really going into the metaverse to do virtual reality and prescription gaming for victims anywhere, and also a high-funded entrepreneurial program for victims of trafficking and others. The key aspect of serving victims and providing care for victims is helping victims. Victims, we have survivor mentors on staff, are some of the key individuals that have the most profound intelligence that assists victims in transforming and healing. And we have to also understand that when we think of that word genocide, we think of the heart and mind and soul of a victim. The fact that I can actually speak clearly, it took years, and I won't say my age. Okay, but try to figure it out, I don't know. But I was in my late 30s before I could actually speak clearly and be confident enough, even as an actor on a TV series, and really feel comfortable in my own skin. And so it's really important that the mental health aspects of victims is seen at a higher level, and the prevention and generational care for families. We've also worked with over 3,000 men who are buyers, in addition to former traffickers. If we're going to assist victims of trafficking, women and girls, we have to have much more education for men and boys and families in this country and all around the world. And not to bring up Ukraine so much, but because of the millions of women and girls who are being moved into this genocidal aspect with Putin, we know that a lot of these women and girls are being trafficked. We know there's labor trafficking for some of the boys. And so we have to do all we can for nations and communities right here in this country and around the world when we think of prevention and services. The numbers have unfortunately gone up. They haven't gone down. And so this is really important to me as well. And I wanted to just kind of close by stating that the fact that I'm here today, this is my first time speaking at the United Nations, not my first time being invited, is an incredible honor. And I hope to serve and to be of service to anyone here. But if we don't look at mental health across the globe and begin to scale services to victims and have cross-pollination and culture carriers to every nation, we will not reduce the numbers of human trafficking. It won't happen. And so thank you very much.
Thank you, Brooke. Our next speaker is Helen Taylor, the Vice President of Impact at Exodus Cry. She'll speak of what she learned from 10 years working with women in the sex industry around the world. Helen is the Vice President of Impact for Exodus Cry, an international anti-trafficking organization committed to abolishing sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. Exodus Cry has produced award-winning films and documentaries, including Nefarious, Liberated, which I have seen. They are amazing, eye-opening documentaries about the sex trade. And Exodus Cry has also launched global campaigns against Pornhub. Helen oversees Exodus Cry's outreach to victims of trafficking. She has trained over 3,000 individuals in 12 nations on outreach and led anti-trafficking initiatives around major world sporting events in Brazil and Russia. She is the author of Exodus Cry's Intervention Manual, a guide for reaching those in the sex industry, utilized in 28 countries. Helen, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I'd like to dedicate my remarks today to every survivor of the global sex trade. Our fight is and always will be for you. I'd like to extend my most heartfelt thanks to CFAM and the permanent mission of Belarus and the Philippines. It is a tremendous honor to be here on an issue that I think we can all agree in this room is one of the most urgent and important of our time. 13 years ago, as a young student, I traveled to Cambodia for a summer where I was first exposed firsthand to the issue of trafficking. I later moved to that nation working as an art therapist and have been with our organization, Exodus Cry, for 10 years. I'm originally from the UK. In the last 10 plus years, I've been to red light districts around the world, conducting outreaches, operations, and trainings across the US, South America, Asia, and Europe. I feel like this event is extremely timely, knowing that it's the United Nations 16 days of activism against the violence of women and girls. And I am convinced that there is no greater system of violence and inequality against women and girls than the system of prostitution. It is a global industry of commercial sexual exploitation. And the reason I use the term the sex trade and prostitution is because when we're talking about sex trafficking, women and children are trafficked into these very industries, prostitution. We must talk about the violence in this industry. The largest study on prostitution across 9 different nations showed that 63% of women in prostitution have been raped, 71% physically assaulted, 68% met the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, same as combat veterans and victims of state-organized torture. Another study showed that women in prostitution exhibit the same rate of traumatic brain injury as documented torture survivors. 92% of trafficked women report being subjected to physical violence, shot at, strangled, burnt, beaten, stabbed, and punched. This is very devastating information, and I will say it is consistent with what I have personally seen and been told firsthand by survivors. Women have told me of near-death experiences at the hands of traffickers and sex buyers. Stories of near-death experiences being thrown out of cars or escaping, nearly dying. I've heard from survivors who have been thrown from 3-story buildings by sex buyers after refusing a sex act. I know one survivor who survived, who had facial reconstruction surgery. I've seen branding tattoos and scarred arms from self-harming and cutting. The post-traumatic stress disorder with survivors of trafficking that I've seen devastates me to my core, and that is something that our organization provides, trauma therapy for survivors. The scars of this industry are often lifelong. I've intervened in 2 near suicides where the individuals were minutes away from taking their own life. And our team recently attended the funeral of someone we knew in their life who was murdered, which is not uncommon when the mortality rate for those in prostitution is 60 to 120 times higher. There is a reason why someone who gets out of the life is called a survivor. In 2018, I led a team to Russia during the World Cup, where we conducted different outreaches, undercover operations, ultimately exposing a trafficking ring that was brought to justice eventually. One place where we did outreach was on the outskirts of Moscow in a forest where pimps would drop off their women in multiple minibuses, and our team were given permission to take care packages, including an invitation to an STD clinic, which we could invite them to. And John's sex buyers would drive down this dirt road to the forest, and they would shout a number out of their car window. And that number was the monetary rate that they were willing to pay for a girl. Each woman knew their monetary value, and so the women, if he called out the lowest number, they would come and do a line-up in front of his car. If he didn't like the look of any of them, he would shout out the next highest monetary number he'd be willing to pay, and the next bus of girls would come out. I saw this with my own eyes, and even after doing this work for multiple years, I felt like someone was punching me in the gut. I thought of no greater dehumanizing expression of women being bought and sold and valued in this way. And then just the horror of seeing one girl with often 2 or 3 men drive down either into the forest or out onto the highway to a hotel, not knowing what could happen to her that night. Over here in the US, we have one state, Nevada, which has legalized brothels. And a few years ago, I did multiple outreaches in these brothels. Upon walking in, a bell is rung, and all the women in the brothel are called to do a lineup in front of you. And I felt deeply uncomfortable because I was put in the position of a sex buyer. And I asked if any of the women would like to speak to me. I didn't want to have to select a woman. I was just there to spend time with them, speak with them, and frankly, research more about what is taking place inside these legal brothels in Nevada. Every time the women were not allowed to choose whether whether they would like to give me a tour, I had to select a woman. And I can tell you that the visual of Russia and Nevada was strikingly similar. No matter the cultural expression, one thing remains consistent. The sex trade is an industry of violence and inequality against women and children, often the most vulnerable and marginalized. A more recent development and expression that I've seen is the online sexual exploitation. Trafficking victims not only experience the physical exploitation, but now they are also filmed by traffickers or buyers, and these videos are used to either market them or uploaded to porn sites. We've seen pornography websites that have nothing in place to verify age or consent. And our organization powered a campaign which became a global movement called Trafficking Hub in 2020, exposing that even prominent websites such as Pornhub did not have adequate procedures in place to verify age and consent, resulting in hundreds, possibly thousands of illegal videos on their site. At the end of 2020, Pornhub was forced to delete 80% of their website, which was 10 million videos. They blamed our organization in their statement, which I took for them giving us credit. And since then, we have proposed new laws that need to be put in place to adequately verify age and consent, because we know that these million-dollar websites care more about money than people. We've seen an explosion of revenge porn, better termed image-based sexual abuse, and children being used in webcam exploitation and child sexual abuse material. Meanwhile, the porn industry and porn sites profit from the violent fantasies of rape and torture. Prior to their purge, a result for a search on Pornhub for the term waterboarding produced more than 100,000 results. The sex trade is built on principles of inequality, gender inequality, where we see that 99% of buyers are men, or men taking a female partner to the brothel or hotel. 70 to 98% of victims are women or those who identify as women. Secondly, economic inequality. Most sex buyers, according to the largest study on sex buyers ever done, earn more than $100,000 per year. They have a disposable income. Traffickers make hundreds of thousands per year from each victim they exploit. Racial inequality. Black and indigenous people of color are overly represented consistently in the sex industry. I was in Europe throughout the summer and was consistently told that in countries like Germany and the Netherlands, it's not native women who are being exploited and sold, and that was what I saw for myself. It's immigrant women from the most poor and marginalized countries. And lastly, power inequality between the trafficker and the woman. but also the buyer, who has the power, the agency, the money, the control, the choice. The prostituted woman was most likely sexually abused as a child. Up to 84% experience this. And we commonly see foster care youth, the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, often from a sexual or racial minority, immigrants, single mothers. There is a significant power imbalance in prostitution. For me, being in Amsterdam over the summer and still in the year 2022, seeing women behind windows being commodified and sold was like a slap in my face as a woman. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary declared 2022's word of the year to be gaslighting. Now, gaslighting is the act or practice of grossly misleading someone for someone else's advantage. I think this word is actually a perfect term for what we're currently seeing taking place in our culture. Women and girls are being gaslit by a multi-billion-dollar sex industry to believe that the sex trade is not the system of oppression and violence that we know it to be, but somehow rebranded as empowering, liberating, sex positive. The capitalization and commodification of women's bodies and sexuality is everything feminism fought against. Billion-dollar porn sites such as Pornhub and OnlyFans are now the new pimps. Even the term sex worker seems to normalize exploitation as work and is so vague that many don't realize it actually includes third parties. Traffickers, brothel owners, and pimps, often who are quoted in the media. If you do background research, they are financially profiting from the individuals that they're exploiting. To say you're fighting for sex workers' rights then begs the question, whose rights are you fighting for? The rights of pimps to trade girls and own brothels? The rights of economically privileged middle-class men to rent vulnerable women's bodies for sex? The rights of women to be exploited in an industry that puts them at extreme risk of violence and harm every day, often causing lifelong PTSD, and call it a job like any other? This is surely the sex industry's biggest gaslighting scam of all. We believe we must fight for a better world for women and children where they are offered exit services, housing, jobs, not jail. A world where she doesn't have to sell her body to survive, and a world where traffickers and abusers are actually held accountable to the full extent of the law. 13 years into this work, I feel the urgency for prevention more than ever. To me, prevention is identifying the most vulnerable populations and seeking to actively reduce their vulnerability through outreach and education, and secondly, reducing demand. Trafficking is an issue of supply and demand. No buyers equals no business. We have two choices. Pass legislation that will shrink the sex trade, help women exit, offer opportunities, and still hold buyers and pimps accountable, a law that we support called the abolitionist equality model, or pass legislation that will fully legalize the sex industry, turning states and nations into pimp states, removing all social and criminal deterrents from buyers and aspiring traffickers. More demand always equals more supply. Worldwide, we must urgently focus our efforts on shrinking exploitation, not growing it. There's lots of work to be done here at home and globally, and look, I know this is a complex issue and sex trafficking cannot easily be uprooted overnight. But the long-term roadmap is clear. If we want to see gender equality, we must pass the equality model to uproot sex trafficking. If we want to see women and children protected from the recurring trauma of image-based sexual abuse online, we must pass laws to protect them and hold websites hosting their abuse criminally accountable. That is our vision, and we won't stop until we see it, because women and children and survivors deserve our best fight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. I would invite everyone to really visit the Exodus Cry's website to see. They have a lot of really helpful material that breaks down what is an abolitionist approach to trafficking, and what it means, and what it entails practically, and to really eye-opening material, very high production value. Just to give you a taste, we'd like to show you a video produced by Exodus Cry. And let me see.
Sex trafficking is a massive global injustice, enslaving millions of people around the world. 98% of those victims are women and children. Every year, millions of new victims will be coerced, deceived, or taken and sold into a world where they will be forced to sell their bodies and souls for the sexual gratification of men. At its root, sex trafficking is a result of male demand for prostitution. Pimps and traffickers have generated a $100 billion per year sex trafficking industry by acquiring the supply to meet that demand by any means necessary. In countries that have legalized prostitution, these dynamics are even more deadly. These countries see an explosion in demand, which directly leads to an increase in sex trafficking. The larger the sex trade grows, the more sex trafficking flourishes. If sex trafficking is fueled by men's demand for prostitution, then there is ultimately only one way to abolish it. We must eliminate the demand. In 1999, after 30 years of research and listening to the experiences of hundreds of women in prostitution, Sweden introduced a new law to do this very thing, known as the abolition model. The abolition model addresses the demand for prostitution head-on by criminalizing the act of buying sex and holding accountable the pimps, brothel owners, and traffickers who profit from selling people for sex. It also creates a shift in how women in prostitution are treated. Rather than criminalize the women who are being exploited in prostitution, the abolition model offers them assistance and social support services to help them build a sustainable life outside of prostitution. Since its adoption in Sweden, this law has had a dramatic impact on reducing both prostitution and sex trafficking. Street prostitution has been cut in half. The number of men buying sex has been cut in half. And while some argue that this has driven prostitution underground, that is simply not true. By its very nature, prostitution must remain visible and accessible to the men who want to buy sex. The truth is that Sweden now has the lowest number of sex trafficking victims in the entire European Union. Due to this incredible success, more and more countries around the world are adopting the abolition model. By doing so, they are protecting the rights of women to attain a life free from exploitation. In order to abolish sex trafficking, we must eliminate the demand for prostitution. Join the movement to stop the business of sexual exploitation. Share this video. Tell the world the truth about prostitution.
Thank you again, Helen. Our next speaker is Eleanor Gayetan. Canelli. Gayetan. The Vice President, I apologize. The Vice President and Director of Public Policy for the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. Eleanor is a has worked on human trafficking while working for USAID in Romania 25 years ago. She was the State Department Human Trafficking at the State Department Human Trafficking Office here in the U.S. And was the lead editor for 5 annual trafficking in person reports. She also worked for the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. And Eleanor, without more, you have the floor.
Thank you, Stefano. It's an honor to be here today, especially with 3 advocates who I admire very much. Brooke, Helen, and Marian, in their fields, have done remarkable things. And thank you to our sponsors, the governments of Belarus and Philippines, to our organizer, our friends, the Center for Family and Human Rights. Lisa Carenti especially has done great work organizing this. So there's the next slide. Here we go. 22 years ago this month, the United Nations General Assembly adopted 3 protocols to supplement the Convention on Transnational Organized Crime. One of the protocols was dedicated to human trafficking. General Secretary Kofi Annan urged member states to ratify it, explaining, "I believe the trafficking of persons, especially of women and children, for sexual exploitation is one of the most egregious violations of human rights that the UN now confronts. It is widespread and growing." As of last month, 180 parties had signed this protocol, ratifying the convention, so it signifies widespread consensus. But tragically, human trafficking is still widespread and growing. Why? Let me highlight 3 broad challenges in the domain of law and law enforcement that have profoundly undermined our ability to limit this crime and shrink the sex trafficking market. Here's a chart from the 2022 Trafficking in Persons report produced by the US State Department, and this is drawn from foreign government data from foreign governments. Prosecutions have dropped about 45% between 2015 and 2021. Convictions have dropped about the same rate between 2019 and 2021. What's happening here? We know more, and yet there are fewer prosecutions, fewer convictions. These cases are extremely hard to take. They're hard to prosecute, mainly because worldwide, prosecutors rely on victim testimony. But victims have typically developed complex PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as a result of their experience in the sex trade. A 9-country study by Dr. Melissa Farley of over 700 women in prostitution found they suffered PTSD at rates the same as combat veterans and victims of state torture. So they also use alcohol and drugs to cope with the experience of having multiple strangers enter them physically day after day. And sometimes they live in fear of traffickers, other times they're trauma bonded to the traffickers. So these become extremely ambivalent victims on the stand, and many cases have fallen apart. So the traumatic nature of the crime has made prosecutions that rely on victims hard, complicated, and expensive to successfully prosecute. And you all know what happens if a prosecutor loses a few cases. They don't do them anymore. So we're seeing that in this data. So the second and third major legal barriers relate to this fact. Sex trafficking has moved online, as confirmed by Europol. Let me give you a real-world example. Backpage.com was founded in 2004 to run online ads for prostitution that were being rejected by traditional newspapers as obscene. By 2015, 11 years later, it was running city-specific sites in 97 countries, making over $500 million in cumulative profit. Here's Politico's description of Backpage.com. Quote, "It was the scourge of law enforcement officials across the country whose investigative files teemed with hundreds of examples of cases that had connections to ads on the site. A young girl forced to perform sex acts at gunpoint, choked to the point of seizures, and gang raped. A woman whose pimp fed her drugs, stole her identification documents, and sexually assaulted her with a firearm. Yet another woman who tried to escape her pimp by jumping out of a vehicle on the highway and was run over and killed. Attorneys general in multiple states have tried to shut down the site and prosecute its owners, and all had failed." Interactive computer services are so far remarkably unaccountable. In part, it's because of a 1996 U.S. law, the Communications Decency Act, Section 230. American courts have interpreted it as providing almost blanket immunity to digital platforms that facilitate trafficking, and that practice has just spread worldwide. As a result, social media is now being used to target and recruit victims, including mainstream platforms such as Twitter. The Nicosi Law Center is currently suing Twitter. Get a sense of why when you hear the facts of the case. A 13-year-old boy in Florida thought he was talking to a 16-year-old girl on Snapchat. He also thought those pictures disappear immediately. They don't. The 16-year-old girl, who wasn't, asked the boy to share nudes, then to demonstrate sex acts, and then to do sex acts with his 13-year-old friend. Luckily, they blocked the interlocutor when she asked to meet. But 2 years later, the boys were horrified when all these images were made into a film and posted on Twitter. One boy was suicidal. Luckily, his mother got a call from a friend and intervened. But when the family tried to get Twitter to take the material off, it violates federal law. It's child sexual abuse material. Twitter examined it and came back in writing, it doesn't violate our community standards. Meanwhile, thousands and thousands of views and retweets had piled up for this material. So laws have not kept pace with sex trafficking as it moved online and became even more profitable as pornography of trafficking victims, especially children, is monetized. And this material mutates. It spreads to other platforms across the world, making it almost impossible to take down, especially when companies like Toronto-based MindGeek, which owns Pornhub, choose to ignore victims. I have a friend who was 18 when her boyfriend took secret videos of her and engaged in sex with him. He posted them to Pornhub, and 15 years later, they're on 45 sites around the world. They'll never come down. Until I met and interviewed women who had experienced, people, all kinds of people who have experienced this phenomena, I didn't realize how traumatizing it is. It's as though they're experiencing abuse over and over and over. It's a never ending. Whereas the experience of sex trafficking could be in the past, and you learn ways to cope with it. If Brooke's nodding, you know this is true for many people. It's a more traumatizing experience than we knew. I'm going to mention one other case because it's the case of Serena Fleitas, who was featured by Nick Kristof in a very important piece in the New York Times in December 2020. So Serena was 13 and new at school. She just moved into the school. She never kissed a boy. She had a crush on a boy who asked her to send nudes. She did that. He posted the images to Pornhub. So Serena pretended she was her mother to try to get them down, waited a few weeks, pretended she was a lawyer to try to get them down, and they were up and wouldn't go away. So Serena ran away. She ran into a trafficker who said, your pictures are up on the internet anyway, you might as well make money. And he began prostituting her. She became addicted to heroin. When Nick Kristof met her and wrote this story, she was living in a car with 3 dogs. So not only is there no legal regime holding these digital platforms accountable, but law enforcement has neither the training or tools necessary to take online traffickers down. This issue is exemplified in an extraordinary report released in 2020 on technology-facilitated trafficking of children in the Philippines. It was conducted by IJM, International Justice Mission, in cooperation with the government. And these horrific crimes include the sexual torture of a child in real time in the Philippines at the direction of an offender sitting in Germany or the UK or the US or anywhere in the world. And then servers facilitating cyber trafficking are often someplace else. IGM's detailed report found the prevalence of online sexual violence like this against children tripled in 3 years, 2014 to 2017. As an officer at UNODC observed, that's the UN's Office of Drugs and Crime, when a crime is planned in one country, with victims in another country, and a customer in a third one, law enforcement authorities face practical challenges such as finding and securing evidence, as any investigation requires cooperation across borders and a certain level of digital expertise. So wrapping up, this was a very quick and in fact superficial summary. I strongly recommend 2 documents in particular. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe produced a policy response paper on technology-facilitated trafficking in 2021. And UNODC did a working group paper, Successful Strategies for Addressing the Use of Technology to Facilitate Trafficking. Of course, they delve into a lot of topics, including ideas like more effective cybercrime legislation, mandating info sharing between companies and law enforcement, age and consent verification, developing jurisprudence on liability, and then safety by design, which the UK is the head of, which is mandating that products be designed with the safety and needs of a child first. Of course, technology can be part of the solution. Evidence can be generated through AI for cases, and AI can be used to detect and delete, especially child pornography. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eleanor. Our final speaker on the panel is Marion Kendall, Executive Director of Lifeway Network, which is an organization that confronts the reality of human trafficking every day by changing the future for women survivors through its safe housing program and increased awareness and engagement through its education program. Lifeway Network is an abolitionist organization and carries out its work through a trauma-informed approach. Marion, you have the floor. If you just press the button, there you go. Oh, press it again. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you to the delegation of Belarus and the Philippines for continuing to bring awareness about this incredibly difficult subject matter to the forefront. And for the panelists, we have done really good work in the anti-trafficking movement. But I ask you a question. When Eleanor, Helen, and Brooke talked about the survivors that they've encountered and also having that personal experience, supporting survivors, where do you think survivors go once they have been extracted out of the trafficking situation and or exited on their own terms? Lifeway Network was founded 15 years ago. It answered a question that had been asked. What are those critical needs for survivors of human trafficking? We learned that one of the most incredible needs for a survivor is safe housing, preventative education, and continued awareness. Let me take you down to what happens to a woman once she's extracted or leaves the trafficking situation and is faced with the reality of, what do I do next? Lifeway Network accepts women 24 hours, 48 hours, or 72 hours post-extraction or exit out of the compelling trafficking situation. We believe that safe harbor is a critical need that every woman or every person who has been impacted by trafficking deserves to have. When you find safety psychologically, safety environmentally, it impacts your ability to think about a sustainable future for your wellness. When a woman enters our safe housing program, most times she enters coming from a trauma experience at an ER, sometimes with no clothing, sometimes with a hospital gown. When she enters our environment, we provide to her a safety, we provide to her a home, not a shelter, a place where they are credible messengers, advocates of compassion, and a system that looks at every individual survivor from a trauma lens and look at their care from a biopsychosocial perspective. We do not believe in a one-size-fits-all system. We believe that every woman creates a pathway for herself by Lifeway Network and the other supporting organizations around, providing those resources and network. Safety is incredibly important, and I encourage everyone to think about the mission of eradicating human trafficking. Before we can address all of the complicated issues, the legal issues, an individual needs to be housed, needs to be safe, needs their feelings to be restored. Lifeway helps women, supports them in reclaiming their lives, building a stronger foundation for themselves, reframing their experiences of exploitation. Then we add them to the table so that they can become policymakers, they can become advocates for others. But the most important thing I would like to stress to this delegation, safety. Once a woman comes out or a person comes out of the trafficking experience, she cannot conceive a life for herself in terms of finding the best employment, in terms of looking to address her own mental health needs. None of us in our rightful capacity can address our mental health needs if there are other areas of our lives and those needs are not being met. Lifeway is led by survivors of human trafficking. We are informed by survivors of human trafficking. We incorporate a trauma-informed lens in all aspects of our policies to support survivors. We provide short-term and long-term emergency, transitional, semi-independent living, and a continuum of community support. Our safe housing program focuses on community, being in relationship with one another, healing, whether it is traditional healing through psychotherapy and pharmacology management, and or healing that is governed through gardening, taking a walk in a garden, taking a stroll with others, economic empowerment, and I'm drawing a blank right here, economic empowerment and life skills. And those things are so important. We've learned through our work in the last 15 years that when a woman comes into our environment, some of her basic needs are interrupted. And when you think about trauma, the onset of trauma is seen throughout the person's life on a continuum. I can tell you right now, we service women who are 35, 45, 50, and 60 years old, who are just learning how to sort their laundry, who are just learning how to cook a meal for themselves. We have servicing women who have been prostituted for 35, 40 years. So think about the life expectancy of that woman post the exit. Studies have shown without any kind of care coordination and support, the mortality rate of a survivor is 7 years. Studies have also shown with support, healing can take about 10 years or on a continuum for many. And in conclusion, I would like for the delegation to think about when we are thinking about policies and we are thinking about supporting survivors at a higher level, one of the things that we should really consider and push for in our policies are safe harbor. New York is about over 19 million people. There are 2 organizations in New York that supports survivors of human trafficking. Lifeway is one of those organizations. And we don't only support domestic-born survivors, we support survivors of all forms of labor, all forms of trafficking, domestic and foreign, from 38 countries around the world. But we are 2 organizations that's providing this service. That should give us pause. 19 plus million people in the state of New York. New York often falls in the top 5 or 10 as a state with pervasive trafficking experiences, but there are only 2 safe houses. So funding opportunities, funding safe housing program to help women think about a sustainable recovery and a sustainable pathway to their own wellness is incredibly important. And I thank you again to the delegation in Belarus and Philippines for bringing this incredible topic out in the open, and so that we can continue to provide and support one another as we all try to eradicate human trafficking. And before I end, I would like to say this opportunity is truly dedicated to the women I serve each and every day. Women who are broken, women who are looking for support, women who did not have a choice. And when we think about prostitution, we say people have choices, but I encourage you to think about all of the circumstances that leads one to think this could be an opportunity for them to raise themselves and raise their families. So this is for the survivors who feel that they don't have a voice. And I think today, between the panelists, we are bringing that voice. We work with survivors, we know what their needs are, and we encourage you to listen to their needs and let's act upon it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Marion, for reminding us of the hard work that needs to get done, and not just the policy work that needs to get done. There's a lot of hard work that needs to get done, and thank you very much for doing that. Thank you. Before we turn the floor over to questions and comments from member states and others, I just wanted to give the floor quickly to Lisa Correnti from CFAN, my colleague, who helped put this event together on some of the CFAM's perspectives on this.
Excellencies, distinguished guests and colleagues, CFAM would like to highlight the nexus between the protection of the family and the protection of women and children from sexual exploitation. Traffickers seek any vulnerability to recruit and groom their victims, including poverty and family instability. Stable families provide a shield for the vulnerable. There is an urgent need to strengthen families to protect potential trafficking victims before they are exploited and abused. Children are coming under a barrage of degrading sexual images and content. This is not just a symptom of a decadent society, it is a symptom of a sexual degeneracy on a massive societal scale, often escalating to criminal behaviors like rape, prostitution, and child pornography. It is absolutely clear in this regard, prostitution and pornography are keystones of the ecosystem of sexual dysfunction, criminal violence, and exploitation that pervades our societies. The causal link of pornography to violence and abuse is well established. Pornography use leads to violent pornography and child pornography, which in turn relate to increases in sexual violence. While the global community rightfully focuses on ending violence against women and children, they largely ignore that pornography contributes heavily to increased violence. Similarly, we know, based on years of evidence, that legal prostitution fuels trafficking in women and children. Given this undisputable evidence, it is irresponsible for the UN system to promote the position that legal prostitution can help mitigate the harms of sex trafficking. In the same way, they should not promote the view that some pornography or peer-to-peer sexual exchanges may not be harmful for children and adolescents, as we saw in a UNICEF-sponsored manual on digital safety for children last year. Nor should the UN Special Rapporteur for Health suggest that prostitution could be a desired profession for some girls to aspire to. There can be no compromise with prostitution and pornography. Because of CFAM's particular mission to safeguard the dignity of all, before closing, I'd like to address the exploitation of women by the global abortion industry. While we understand that countries and organizations take different positions on abortion, we should all agree that the abortion industry must not be allowed to make money from sex trafficking or allow sex traffickers to use abortion as a tool to keep women in sexual slavery. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. We now have some opportunities for member states and others to comment or ask questions. I understand that we have representatives from the Ukraine and the Russian Federation who are here and would like to comment. Are there others who would like to speak? I see Nicaragua. Anyone else? Very well. If you could have, Ukraine, if you want to take the floor first. I thought that's why you gave me that.
Organizers for convening this really crucial and event on a very critical and pressing topic, and my special appreciation to all the panelists for your strong statements and for your courageous efforts in combating these heinous crimes, as it is trafficking in women and children. My question today is to the representative of Belarus, because could you please explain how direct participation on the side of the aggressor correlates with a true commitment to combating trafficking in women and children? Because the use of the territory of Belarus in February 24 this year enabled the occupation of the northern part of Ukraine, in particular Irpin, Bucha, Chernihiv, and also it's enabled attacks on Kiev. As of today, this brutal and justified war uprooted some 14.5 million Ukrainians, or 1/3 of the population of Ukraine. And today, more than 7.7 million people, mostly women and children, have been seeking safety abroad. As repeatedly noted in relevant reports on human trafficking, displacement creates additional risks for women and children to become victims of human trafficking. So please explain how genuine your commitment is in combating trafficking, in human trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll take a few questions together. I'd like to ask that you focus on the subject of the presentation as much as possible. We understand there are many important issues, but it's also very important that no matter our differences and no matter what the situation is on differences we may have on many issues across the board on the UN agenda, it's very important that we respect this topic as one on which we can all work together. I understand in Nicaragua, if you had a comment or a question?
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Nicaragua would like to express its appreciation to the permanent mission of Belarus and the Philippines for the organization of this highly relevant event, as well as the support in civil society, Center for Family and Human Rights, CFAM, Exodus Cry, and Campaign Life Coalition. We also thank the panelists for the insights and their very touching presentations. We also fraternally welcome the presence of compañero Yuri Ambresevich, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Belarus. Trafficking in persons constitutes a serious problem for humanity and requires a concerted international response, urging all the states to develop and implement effective measures to prevent, combat, and eliminate all forms of trafficking in persons and to strengthen existing ones in order to end the demand for trafficked persons and to protect them. Human trafficking, as you have well mentioned, is a global scourge, a product of exclusion and inequity of the neoliberal system, which promotes inequality and puts profit before respect for human rights, allowing discrimination and exploitation of human beings due to an inhuman, unjust, and corrupt system. It is necessary to intensify our efforts and, in particular, the cooperation, but based on common but differentiated responsibilities, in which developed countries should take the lead. Since the resources that we need to use for the achievement of the 2030 Agenda are being used to face these challenges. Therefore, we need to promote a real international solidarity and a robust multilateralism in order to comply with the measures to eliminate trafficking in person, including the resolutions adopted in this organization, which will allow us to improve coordination to combat this evil and strengthen at the same time the international cooperation. We believe that the ad hoc committee to elaborate a comprehensive international convention on countering the use of information and communications technologies for criminal purposes can be a key component to better address the cyber challenges and the victims aspects that has been mentioned in your presentations. So we would also like to ask you more to elaborate more on the contributions that perhaps this convention can bring up to this important matter. In Nicaragua, just let me share with you 3 lines. We have a law number 896 against trafficking in person approved in 2015, which regulates the different areas in order to combat trafficking in persons. It has a human rights and gender approach to victims and establishes new procedural aspects that comes to expedite and streamline access to justice. Finally, we emphasize the need for a new social contract to achieve a world which more love, which promotes inclusion, equity, and social justice in order to contribute to the primary commitment of the international community to fight to eradicate this evil in a comprehensive manner. Thank you so much for your time.
Yes, I just want to take, we generally take 3 questions at a time here at the UN, so I'm just going to see if there's any one more question or comment before we come back to the panel. And please identify yourself.
Thank you very much. I'm from the Mission of China. First of all, I want to say that it is a great honor for us to attend this event. Due to some urgent business, my PR is not able to come, but he wishes to send his greetings and appreciations to Vice Minister, ambassadors, and for your extraordinary work to organize this event. And taking this opportunity, we also want to express our appreciation to Belarus and the Philippines for your invaluable work as the facilitators of the resolutions on trafficking in persons and another resolution on trafficking in women and girls in the 3rd committee. We do believe that your great job has raised the awareness of strengthening international cooperation and the coordination against trafficking in persons, and you can always count on China's support. We also want to thank the moderator and our panelists for their robust discussion today. China is a state party to the UN Convention Against the Transnational Organized Crime and also the Palermo Protocol. And we have been actively carrying out their implementation. So far, we have established over 50 hotline liaison mechanisms with 34 countries, set up regular meeting mechanisms with 27 countries, and signed 177 cooperation documents, such as bilateral agreements and MOUs with 54 countries. We have also set up 8 border liaison offices as a channel for law enforcement cooperation, information exchange, and for rescuing, protecting, and handling over victims with our neighboring countries. In recent years, China has carried out many joint law enforcement activities with neighboring countries to crack down on various transnational trafficking crimes and effectively protect women's rights. And today we have a question to the panelists. We thank you for pointing out the important issue of combating trafficking in persons in digital age. And just now we also hear the representative from CFAM talking about the important role of family. So our question would be how to better protect children and youth from traffickers, especially online traffickers. What more can be done? For example, what more can be done in schools, in the communities, and also in families? And also, what more can be done by other stakeholders to better forge a holistic approach and better protect the rights of children and youth? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the representative of China. And we now have an opportunity to give I think at least one round of responses from the panel. Our event is almost finished. So I know, Brooke, you would like to say something?
I just wanted to state that at More to Life, in our offices, one of the focuses that Lifeway reminded me to share is that because of the gaps in services that we're seeing with victims, it's young girls who are pregnant by traffickers. And so in Miami and Tampa and Sarasota, we're actually working on independent living models with wraparound services because the safe house model doesn't always work. And as you look at providing services for victims, independent living is absolutely crucial, in addition to connecting that to entrepreneurship programs that has to do with the authenticity of identity discovery around mental health is extremely important.
Thank you. Helen, do you want to say something?
Yeah, thank you so much for the questions, and I'll just respond to the question from the representative of China regarding protective measures that can be taken around online child exploitation. It's my personal belief that it takes a village, and that this is a conversation for families, schools, communities. No one person or community should blame the other and say it needs to be solely the parents or solely the school or solely the government. This is an all hands on deck situation. I believe that conversations with children, age-appropriate conversations on this topic should begin at the age of 2 years old and should continue on a regular basis in order to monitor more closely their exposure online and on all manner of topics related to sexual boundaries and empowering parents and schools. We put together a website that has dozens of the best resources that we researched over the course of a year on the best resources on this topic for communities, schools, parents, and children. And that website is extrascry.com/PCNP, which stands for Protect Children Not Porn, /resources, and that encompasses, we made a documentary on that topic as well. I think it's a really important question. We need to be proactive, not reactive. And 2 years old sounds incredibly young, but this is the age that children can begin to be exposed to the kind of things we're speaking about. So thank you for your question.
Another solution to your question from China is that a company called Authentic ID, now All for Humanity and Veritas, and some of the work with Thorn, but is creating technology that has to do with fraud prevention. So anytime a child or anyone, even a predator, logs in online, the facial recording of that person is really vetted almost like the college form, so throughout the process. So that child, when they're playing on YouTube Children or their social media is actually monitored, it is actually vetted that that person is that person. So these are some of the Tech for Good solutions that we're doing now, and you can reach out to moretoolife.org, and we can share the work of Jeff Yanni and our work with All for Humanity. And this technology is coming out next year.
Eleanor?
Quickly, we don't let adults approach kids on playgrounds for very obvious reasons. And yet through Discord, for example, the major gaming system, perfect strangers can approach your kids, groom your kids, talk to them for weeks, months, and years, and you don't even know it. That has to stop. These companies have to block strangers from approaching kids online.
Any of Your Excellency.
Update. In the Philippines, we have convicted many child traffickers so far. For example, an Australian, Mr. Peter Scully, was given a 129-year prison sentence. And another Australian has been arrested. The case is still ongoing. We also work closely with the International Justice Mission, which is part of IACAT. And they did the study mentioned. And we also work with the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement to rescue children in the Philippines. Our partnership is wide and borderless. So aside from the immigration, of course, we work with Interpol and other EU agencies too. The demand is great from foreigners for this, but we have a difficult fight, but we are resolute in our stand, and we apply the full force of the law against traffickers and against even family members of these children, some of these children who facilitate the trafficking of their own children. Just as a background. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. Minister.
Thank you, moderator, and thank you all the panelists for what I've heard. And I have to say that after I listened to you, I had a problem. And I had a problem because I'm a representative of a state. And almost nobody of you even mentioned the role of the state in what we are all should do in order to combat trafficking in persons. Once again, the topic of this work is, of course, about dealing and helping victims. But first, we have to combat this evil. And to combat this evil, and this is why I believe that I have to echo what Brooke said about prevention first. And then I was glad to hear what Eleanor said, probably with her past from the State Department. She's very close to my understanding of the situation when you've spoken about prevention, prosecution, and punishment. Without real new level of financing of our national police and enforcement bodies, we will never get rid of this trafficking. Without new level of international cooperation among law enforcement bodies, we will never get rid of this trafficking in persons. Then, of course, when we get situation at our hands, when we have victims, we have to deal with their problems, we have to respond to their needs, to act as psychologists, to help with mental problems, etc., etc. But first of all, we have to combat this evil. And this is why I believe that we should be very realistic when we ask for total elimination of demand for prostitution. Well, we cannot. I'm trying to be responsible in my activities. I can't imagine how we achieve this goal. Just put it as a symbol, as a lozenge. So this is not how the life works at the level of a state. This is why I really called everybody to be very realistic. Of course, when we speak about the situation where we see our societies are evolving and we see that all social constraints and deterrents are going down and down, this is an adverse side of this emancipation, not only of women, but of everybody, in every society, in very close society, in very open societies, and etc., etc. When we speak about prevention, it goes without saying not only about trafficking in person, but it goes without saying about the war and any conflicts that fuel the trafficking in persons everywhere, not only in Europe. And well, of course, this is not a time and place to discuss the issue of Ukraine, but Belarusian position is quite clear about root causes of this conflict, and we are not hiding ourselves. We've spoken loudly and publicly about that we differ with you on the root causes of this problem. So I would like to once again to call in everybody that we have to facilitate international cooperation among legal law enforcement bodies first of all. This is why we were mentioning this Palermo Protocol, which is the major tool to do this. If even within one country, I believe you will agree with me that when there are some law enforcement bodies, they always in competition among themselves. Same happens to international cooperation. We all preserve our national sovereignty over our national territory, over specific national responsibilities. And when the politicization comes into this sphere, it makes even more difficult to have even a response from even our neighboring country on what happened to this girl or that man. And this is a huge, huge problem. So I believe that when we speak about prevention, we have to think about all these issues from the very beginning and not disregard the interests of others. This is the major problem, that we all believe in our unique truth. And this is a very sad situation. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe we have run out of time, but I hope this is only the beginning of a conversation. We can certainly continue this conversation outside of this meeting. Please don't hesitate to be in touch with us, so we can put you in touch with the speakers and to continue this conversation. Again, thank you very much. This event was also webcast, so it will be available for viewing later. You can share it on your social media and on your websites. Thank you very much to everybody for attending.